It's This Week in Creationism, Episode 18. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we look at the headlines from creationism from the past week. This week we have groundbreaking human history book from Answers in Genesis, a little bit more on Adam and Eve and Ken Ham. We look at Answers in Genesis top hits from the last year. That and more coming up. Hey, where else can we begin this week? But we have to talk about the fact that Answers in Genesis has uploaded a new book to their bookstore ready for pre-order. It won't be released until March, but looks like the advertising blitz has begun, and the promotional blitz. And so we have a title, we have a cover, we have a back cover, and we have endorsements on the bookstore to talk about. So the book is Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise. And so that's by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. This is a follow-up of his book Replacing Darwin from more than 7 years ago, in which he is extending his, I guess you could say, his population genetics model to try to understand how to look at the history of all peoples on Earth, including even those extinct lineages since the flood, and explain them within the context of all going back to Noah and his family, and ultimately to Adam and Eve. In part, this is a response, or will be at least, I think, promoted as a response to Joshua Swami Das's The Genealogical Adam and Eve, published just a couple years ago, and then the more recent book. And of course, Jeanson was working on this long before William Lane Craig's book came out, but it's kind of convenient that Craig's book is out and getting a lot of press right now, In Quest of the Historical Adam. And so Ken Ham and others at Answers in Genesis will be kind of pushing this as sort of, hey, this is the alternative model within the young Earth perspective of how to understand the world of genetics, and specifically human genomics, and how it supports a young history of the human race. Now, like I said, Nathaniel Jeanson's been working on this for quite some time. He has talked about it in different venues at different times, and I've seen him talk about it. He had a long series with Ken Ham, and actually in which he kind of outlined probably most of the series and talked about most of the questions that are in here. I'm not sure I'm going to be surprised when I open up this book, in the sense of like this is anything new that we haven't heard before. But certainly it'll be packaged in a form that will be pushed out to the general young Earth creationist audience. And so, and we have a similar sort of approach, marketing-wise, really, pushing the importance of this book, just like Replacing Darwin. So look at Ken Ham's endorsement at the top here. Dr. Jeanson has found the Rosetta Stone of human history. And then on the product page, we find it's groundbreaking scientific research that rewrites everything you thought you knew about race, ethnicity, and even human history. Those are pretty bold statements, especially since it's going to be a used word, rewrite, groundbreaking. If something is going to rewrite and be groundbreaking, then it needs to truly be it needs to be well done, right? It needs to be convincing. And so we'll see, if he is coming up with anything new. I mean, I've seen what he's already said, and I'm not willing to call that groundbreaking yet, but we'll see when we open up the book. So here's the back. I did want to reflect upon this book versus Replacing Darwin, and the influence that prior book has had, and what I think will happen with this coming book. So this kind of fits in with my This Year in Creationism, which is the thing I just recorded last week. And so there I reflected upon what I think will be really important events in the world of young Earth creationists coming up. Talked about the movie Is Genesis History, the second movie that they're making. And I talked about other things that I think are important directions that young Earth creationists are going. And one thing I neglected to talk about, or at least some have thought that I neglected, and yeah, I'll say that I neglected. I should have said something about Jeanson's work here because I knew that this book was in the works and would be published this year. So I should have said something about that book possibly being an important milestone also in young Earth creationism. But honestly, I don't think it's going to be an important milestone. I think that it'll get a lot of hype and it will sound like a milestone. But to be a true milestone and truly shape the history of young Earth creationism, it actually has to change minds and change the direction of thought. And young Earth creationists have to embrace it. Right? They have to, all the experts in the field and others have to embrace the idea and then use that idea as something to move forward, move the science forward, move the discussion forward. Again, I haven't seen the book yet, but unless he has something brand new in here that is more convincing than what he's already published, I don't see it making those changes, because replacing Darwin was also a very bold title and was promoted as if it were this groundbreaking revolutionary book, but hasn't really received a whole lot of it. Well, it certainly hasn't received any attention outside the young Earth creationist world. Maybe that's not surprising, but it hasn't received a whole lot of attention from within the young Earth creationist world. It has from a variety of Christian young Earth creationist apologists who are kind of users of information, but they're not the thinkers and movers within young Earth creationism. The ones that are actually doing the heavy lifting of doing research and writing on young Earth creationism in order to shape the minds of creationism. They really haven't picked up on that book. It hasn't shaped their thought. There are a few references to it, like you could read that book, but it isn't like now Nathaniel Jeanson's ideas and thoughts and positions have rewritten the minds of other young Earth creationists such that they now act like they're building on his model. I see virtually no reference to his model from other, I guess I'll call them academic young Earth creationists. But I get ahead of myself. Let's look at this back cover here. And we see, so on the back cover, you usually have on the front cover, they had Ken Ham's endorsement. That's obviously going to be the most important one because it's his voice that is the one that's going to be the one that people are going to listen to and decide whether they buy the book. And so he's on the front cover. But on the back cover, they have two endorsements here. A profoundly intriguing book. It throws a new light on ancient history and will leave the reader eager to learn more. That's from a professor of history. And we have a very short clause, two little clauses here. A groundbreaking book, something likely to become a classic. And by somebody, I presume a young Earth creationist of some stripe that I really don't know at all from Sweden, who is a mathematician and statistician. Now, this is interesting, and I think I don't want to push this idea too far, right? But I don't want to read too much into this, but let's think about the way books are published and what typically a revolutionary book would attract in terms of attention and how it would be promoted. And I say that because let's look back at Replacing Darwin when that book came out, right? You had that book, and then if you looked at the back cover, we saw that the back cover actually included several testimonial / endorsements, right? And look at these endorsements. The first one from Kevin Anderson, who's got a PhD in microbiology. He's a young Earth creationist, not affiliated necessarily with Answers in Genesis, directly with Answers in Genesis. So an outside expert is looking at his book and saying, scientific knowledge only grows when popular opinions are tested and scrutinized and comfortable concepts are challenged. In Replacing Darwin, Jeanson asks you to do exactly this question in order to ask the question of what you think you know. I think even Darwin would have been fascinated by this book. All right. That's not a direct endorsement of his ideas are right, but he's saying it's worth at least thinking about. All right. He's put a lot of effort into this. We need to look at this. It's interesting. It makes us uncomfortable. Interesting. Even as a young Earth creationist, it makes us potentially uncomfortable. because it's saying maybe something different than others are. Nonetheless, you have a PhD biologist looking at a book that is discussing PhD biology type questions and suggesting it's worth your time to read this book. We also have Rick Roberts, who is a biology program director with a PhD from Grace College, who recommends the book. And like I said, it's a bold title. It's a rather audacious work, right? Presents challenges to the model of random chance and origins and so forth as we wrestle with this topic. Again, he's not endorsing it in the sense of, hey, Jeanson's got it right. This is the model that young earth creationists need to use. But at least he's saying this book is worth reading and we need to consider, and let's see what happens. That's what I'm saying hasn't really happened. I don't think young earth creationists have really grappled that much of the book. That hasn't created the kind of discussion that these authors are suggesting it should. And then Andrew Fabich, also PhD, microbiology. The arguments of the book are unique and fresh. I only have high recommendations for this book. All right, so those are nice recommendations and endorsements for a book. And so there you have PhD biologists who are recommending a book written by a PhD biologist. And this is what you want, right? You want, if you have ideas, especially ideas that are going to be controversial or they're going to be revolutionary, right? You want other people to recognize they're at least worth thinking about and that they potentially are revolutionary. And I just don't understand why this new book, the best they could do is come up with a professor of history and a statistician that are names that we don't know, right? The average young earth creationist out there interested in buying this book will have no idea who those two people are. Whereas they might know if they were established young earth creationist biologists at major creationist ministries like Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research or Creation Ministries International. If you go to the bookstore and you look at the rest of the recommendations, there's a whole list of other endorsements there for the book, and none of them are by scientists, right? They're all theologians, and some of them are, again, names that are not well-known names at all. And so it's rather mysterious that at this point, and it's still early. I mean, maybe in 2 months they're holding back on like the big names, all right, who will come forward and say this is a revolutionary book and everybody should read it. And every creationist should grab a hold of this thing. And Jeanson's ideas they ring true. So you need that. Now, there are personalities within the young earth creationist world. Right now, all the recommendations are on the Answers in Genesis website come from Answers in Genesis. Who read the book, who reviewed the book, and anyone who reviewed the book, are they willing to recommend the book? Are they willing to say Jeanson's ideas have merit? Right? Because if no one who can actually understand this material can come out and say these have merit, then why should others take the book seriously? I mean, we're being told this is a revolutionary book, and it's going to answer all these questions. But do they answer those questions? And is the rest of the secular world required to respond to a text if young earth creationists themselves can't endorse the book? It looks like it just comes from Answers in Genesis, and because it does come from Answers in Genesis. Here would be my recommendation for, in terms of like a better way to do this if you want to get more recognition, is if this is truly, an amazing model for understanding population genetics and how you can use DNA to show that that all DNA lineages trace back to Noah. And this is really hot stuff, and it's going to revolutionize creation biology, and it's going to seep out and hopefully convince others outside of that world that you're correct. What should have happened is you should get together 3 or 4 other creation biologists who have some kind of expertise in genetics, molecular biology, at least know how to download DNA sequences and manipulate, analyze DNA sequences. You should be able to get those together, and you should have written a book together, right? And it should have crossed across different young earth creationist ministries. Right? When something is published only by a single ministry and only endorsed by a single ministry, by those in the ministry who aren't experts in that field, they simply are just endorsing their friend in this case. The significance, the weight of your work is highly downgraded. And that doesn't mean that it can't be significant. I mean, there are people who are loners and write amazing stuff, and, that maybe they're shy and they can't get other people to endorse their work, but maybe over time people will finally read it and change their minds. I mean, that has happened in history, but you're sure, changing the odds if you don't go about at least attempting to convince your colleagues first. So maybe his method is, I'm going to write this thing myself, and then they're going to read it, and then they'll be convinced, and then they'll start talking about it. But here's the thing. That didn't really happen with replacing Darwin. All right, I wrote this article on my blog, actually in 2018. What's the response been to replacing Darwin, the new origin of species? All right, and I talk in there about how, having watched very carefully the community and seen what their response was, and looked at how often they reference it, and how there have been international creationist get-togethers in which they have many talks about biology, and they talk about species and speciation and different models. And Jeanson's name is like, it's kind of like there. I mean, but Jeanson hasn't even in there. He doesn't even present at those things. And it's sort of like, yeah, we might reference him as sort of like, here's another possible creationist model. So if you're claiming that you're coming up with, here's the book that's going to replace Darwin, and then nobody refers to that book in your own community, that's got to be a little bit concerning, right? And I'm not talking about, there's a whole bunch of people out there that are on the periphery who are just readers of young earth creationist material and love, and they look at it and they're like, oh, there's the proof, right? Jeanson's explained it all, right? He's great. And they kind of think, hey, nobody's responded to Jeanson in like some serious way. Well, I was like, well, does he deserve a serious response if he can't get a response from his own colleagues on this? I mean, here's kind of what I said. I mean, here is what I said. What's worse than ambivalence from the mainstream scientific community? Because Jeanson talks about how he kind of laments the fact that, you people dismiss my work, but you haven't even read it, right? Secular biologists out there, they haven't read my work. And again, why would they read their work if your own community can't get together and agree that it's a serious piece of work? Ambivalence in science from the community peers. That's what the worst thing is. I mean, I've really been surprised how little discussion replacing Darwin has generated among the young earth creationist community. And by community here, I mean the academic community. I don't mean that there aren't people who are commenting on YouTube feeds and blogs and places that are saying, this is the greatest book ever and explains everything, and you'd have to be an idiot not to believe this stuff. I mean, that's not serious academic consideration. Of course, the problem is that there's only a handful of people in the community who would even be able to, judge, much less understand Jeanson's claims. And this is one of the big problems. Just finding someone else who can even evaluate his work honestly and with true, critique, actually pick out and correct his works. And so if it's just people and answers in Genesis, they just look at it like, oh, he's a Harvard-trained scientist, so therefore we're just going to listen to whatever he says. And I just want to have to remind you, he's a Harvard-trained biologist, but he's not trained in this particular field. So he is he's a self-taught expert in this field. And people can be self-taught in fields. There's nothing wrong with that. But he's not a Harvard-trained evolutionary biologist or population geneticist. I don't see any evidence he's even had a class on those different topics. So he is self-trained in this particular area. Yeah, that's too much on that topic. So we'll see what happens over time. Again, like I said, there might be some other young Earth creationist biologists with doctorates in fields that can really assess Nathaniel Jeanson that will come out and strongly endorse the book. I will be a little bit surprised if that happens, partly because I'm not sure that any of them will actually agree enough with what's in the book to make such a strong statement, but also unfortunately there's just personality issues as well in the Young Earth Creationist community. There's sort of a lack of willingness for individuals in one organization to strongly endorse works of those in another organization. And that's just an organizational problem. That's just a social problem within Young Earth Creationism that kind of holds them back from probably making a more stronger statement to the world. Let's move on to the Institute for Creation Research. Here's their front page from a couple days ago, and it's a lot of the same old stuff. By same old stuff, I mean, hey, here's an amazing design in nature, and therefore God must be responsible for that because he's the only one that can design. And so they've really taken on that sort of intelligent design or ID sort of argument and really made it their own, and much more so than the other organizations. And that kind of goes along with their continuous environmental tracking idea of how organisms adapt and change in their environment. And that fits right into the pterosaur article here. The bird article here is basically, hey, they're not cousins, but they do have a lot of similarities, and that's because they're designed both by God, and he just used common designs between both of them. So that explains why they appear to have common ancestry, but they don't. Same thing with the land-plant evolution question, and so forth. But the other big news from Institute for Creation Research, and I just discussed this at length in my yearly, my this year in creationism talk, I mentioned that ICR changed their logo. They've had the same logo for a long time, and they switched it right around the first. And to reflect the fact that they are now emphasizing biology over geology. Not that they've given up on some of their geology, but ICR was almost synonymous with working on radionucleotide type stuff, right? Radiometric dating. And now they're with their new president, Randy Gugliuzza, there's a huge emphasis now on trying to understand biological diversity, adaptation. Where did the different species come from? How are kinds to be understood? This is their center of focus. And they've changed their logo to reflect that because now it has a DNA molecule in it. They're still very much emphasizing the research component of their organization, but it's now research on biology. And so, like I said, I discussed that in my This Year in Creationism, which I released last week. But let's go to one particular article that just came out in this new year. So we see, actually December 30th. And this is, again, from the president, the new president of ICR. And he's still working really hard to sort of reframe the vision and how he really is shaping very strongly ICR's place among the different Young Earth Creationist ministries, how they're different. And how they're different is they're taking a very different angle on how biological diversity has come about, all right, within the Young Earth Creationist framework. And I say that partly because we just talked about Nathaniel Jeanson, who's going to publish a book, and, replacing Darwin has never had any traction within Institute for Creation Research. So Institute for Creation Research very much disagrees with many of the elements of Jeanson's work. So there we see in the Young Earth Creationist world two different powerhouses, I guess you could say, of influence. And that's one of the reasons why Jeanson's work replacing Darwin hasn't really gotten the traction that you would kind of think it might. Because there's a group of other young earth creationists who very much think that he's wrong in many of the aspects of what he's written there. And I suspect they're going to find that what he's going to say in this next book is also wrong. And that's because Institute for Creation Research is taking this hard line against natural selection being a real phenomena in the world and being a mechanism that God has established for how he helps organisms, or how he guides organisms to adapt to changing conditions. And that's reflected in this article here, Finding Biblical Clues to Design. An emphasis of Guliuzza and also now of ICR in their mission statement is that they're going to use the Bible. All right, the Bible first. We're not looking at science and trying to squeeze the Bible out. They're actually basically claiming that other young earth creationists are falling into the trap. He says that in here, not in those exact words, but he's essentially saying they've fallen into the trap of thinking about the science first and then kind of working it into the Bible. And he says, oh, ICR, we are going to start with the Bible. And we actually think, and this I think this is important. He says, we think that the Bible actually contains scientific insights that can guide our research. That we're going to look for elements in the Bible that are speaking specific scientific truths, and we're going to use that as to establish our theories and our hypotheses. Right? So that's that first bullet point there. Let me bring that up a little bigger. The Bible is full of scientific insights that can guide research. All right, so as a second, this article is worth reading if you want to understand where Institutes for Creation Research is going and how it's diverging from the other creationist organizations. It's clear that biology is engineered. Organisms are active and have innate abilities to continually thrive and fill the earth. This is this idea that that it's not natural selection as a force, because they do see that as like the mystical force out there that is shaping organisms. No, biological organisms are engineered. They're active, like the organism themselves, and they have innate abilities to continue to thrive. They have innate abilities to adapt themselves to the environment. They respond to the environment and adapt to the environment, versus natural selection, which is you have a whole bunch of different variants, and that force then selects particular variants that are best survive in that environment. Experiments designed to identify workmanship in living things may be the most efficient path to new biological insights. That's what everything they're going to be doing is. We're going to look for places that look like design, which, well, they're going to say everything is design. And and that is an identification of where God has worked in living things, and so that's where we can get our new insights. Don't ask me like how they do this, because I haven't really seen like a written out scientific method of like how you proceed through this, and how in the end you're gonna have new biological insights that are going to be tested somehow. That's a little bit of a mystery to me. At the end of this article, he does have kind of a list of like things you can do, but it's still not gelled into a clear young earth creationist scientific method that's based on this environmental tracking thing. The correspondence in engineering between creature and man-made things is the general revelation of Christ's power, genius, and wisdom. Saying we can see Christ in the world because organisms are engineered. Right, and man-made things are engineered. We're given the ability to engineer our environment, and we can actually recognize the environment around us is engineered, and therefore that allows us to say God did it. All right, I mean this is all part and parcel of the intelligent design sort of style of arguments for the necessity of God as the ultimate creator. Now, as I say all that, I say, in some respects, I agree with those things, since I believe that God is the architect and the maker of this world, right? Everything in the world is designed. It's a question of how it's designed and what are the mechanisms that what are the mechanisms that result in those particular designs. Answers in Genesis is perfectly comfortable saying that part of that design comes from natural selection, sculpting and selecting upon variation that exists in the organism. Now, they're going to say that variation exists because it was endowed from the very beginning, that variation, rather than new variations can come along. But nonetheless, there's a big difference between these two organizations now. Let's go back to Answers in Genesis real quick. Just a couple more items. I know I spent a lot of time on talking about these first two things. But at the end of the year, Answers in Genesis had, hey, here's our top articles from 2021. Now, top just means here's the ones that got the most hits, right? And those lists are always a little bit misleading, because sometimes you might put something in your wording of your title that ends up just being a hot thing that is contains words that people Google a lot, and they might stumble upon your article but don't really have any interest in your particular perspective, right? And they might not have been interested at all in the topic. They just happen to have your keywords in it. But I think that Brandon Clay is right that it does reveal the types of interest that their audience have. Like, why do people come to Answers in Genesis, and what types of articles do they read? And so here were the top 10. Ancient Bible lifespans. Did Adam live over 900 years? That's a classic, long-standing question that many Christians have, and I think everybody growing up at some point were like, how did they live 900 years? Cain's wife. Where did Cain's wife come from? All right, just another one that's asked over and over and over again. What really happened to the dinosaurs? And then this gets interesting after this. The Equality Act is set to destroy religious freedoms. What should we do? Canada now has an underground church. Our nation is a mess. What does the Bible say? Where are the COVID babies? All right. So you have 4 or 5 of these that are sort of the social issues. Now, that's the other thing I talked about in this year in creationism. I said that Answers in Genesis is not as much here are answers to questions about the physical world, about the scientific questions and how they fit with the scriptures. They've really become the culture wars. How do I answer questions about all things Christianity? And that's reflected in this top 10 article thing, because some of the top articles are more on social issues and don't have anything to do with science. I was a little bit surprised by the Grand Canyon ones, because I don't think of Christians as really having that much interest in the specifics of this new Grand Canyon research that Andrew Snelling's doing, but he gets a lot of hits to that page. So I don't know what the reason for that is. I'd be really interested to know what kind of questions people have that they're searching for when they look at those particular articles. So to Ken Ham and Adam and Eve, Fox News published an article. It was really kind of surprising on their front pages. Not at the top of the page, but toward the bottom of the page, the front page of Fox News website. Christians point to genetics breakthroughs to show Adam and Eve are not incompatible with evolution, and that's quite the title. Evolutionary science is making space for Adam and Eve. Christian scientists say, and so you might think, well, maybe that's the gotcha title, right? That's the clickbait title, and then you're going to get in there and you're going to find out, this is, it's sort of mocking people who believe this, or it's like, we doubt this. No, they actually give quite a bit of space to Josh Swamidass and his book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, talking about William Lane Craig. And it's not until you get all the way to the end that Nathaniel Jeanson is quoted, and he just kind of has a couple throwaway lines about how they think that this is wrong, and it's not a correct view from a young earth perspective. So it's not, in their mind, the biblical perspective. These are non-biblical perspectives not even, possibly not even Christian views. But that's not the tact that the article takes. And I think this is an important article, because it really just shows that how far this particular topic has progressed in terms of the ability of people to discuss Adam and Eve from a genetic standpoint, from the anthropological standpoint, and so forth. This is something that you would not have been published 20 years ago. But there are many, many Christian academics, pastors, and others who have really broken open the box and said, these are topics that we can discuss and talk about. And they're getting a lot of traction in terms of the discussion. And young Earth creationists, of course, aren't terribly happy about this because they've kind of owned this particular question for a long time. It's kind of like, this is the shutdown question. If you're getting into trouble in a internet discussion forum and you're kind of lost, you don't know how to answer certain scientific questions about the, radiometric dating or the age of the Earth or whether foxes and dogs are really related to each other, you can always ask that person, well, what about Adam and Eve? And that's the gotcha, right? If you say, well, Adam and Eve, what's your view on that? And if you don't give them the exact right view, then they just dismiss everything else you say because you don't have the right answer to that question. And so that particular gotcha question is kind of breaking down in the sense that more Christians know that there's literature out there and acknowledge and are reading and at least have open minds to exploring questions about the physical nature and historicity of Adam and Eve. And are recognizing it's a really complex theological and scientific question that serious questions really they wrestle with it. And there aren't easy solutions, despite what Andrews in Genesis tries to make it sound like it's an easy solution. But underneath that veneer of like easy believism, there are some very difficult, thorny questions that are left. Now that's where we come back to Nathaniel Jeanson, right? I mean, this book that he has coming out is kind of like another kind of big giant, I'll call it a giant Band-Aid to put on young Earth creationism to kind of protect them from all these other sources out there, which are in many Christian and even conservative Christian circles, and be able to say, oh, don't read those things, right? That's all nonsense, right? You see, we have somebody who is a PhD scientist from Harvard who now has provided the response. And so there's no need to consider this question anymore. Case closed again, right? We've got our gotcha question back. It resides with us now again. We have the easy answer. Anyone who doesn't, who reads this other stuff, you can suspect is got theological problems. I'll just leave it at that. And you're not going to be surprised to find that Ken Ham was a little annoyed to see this on Fox News. The comment section is really hilarious because it's sort of like Fox News is, gone crazy and, all liberal and all this stuff because they've published this article which doesn't simply denounce evolution straight up. And as Ken Ham says, what he's doing is nothing new. You notice what Ken Ham's doing here? What he's doing is nothing new. The article is referencing Joshua Swamidass, who's a Christian, who wrote this book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. And Ken Ham just can't bring himself to even say his name or acknowledge who he is, and certainly doesn't like to say he's a Christian, right? So to his audience, it's just this person, right? What he's doing is nothing new. It's the same old attempts many others have made over the years to come up with new creative ways of trying to fit man's religion into evolution, into God's word in Genesis. Again, Ken Ham, it's either his way or it's atheistic evolution, as if that's what these people are doing. They're taking evolution and squishing it into the Word of God. That's really not the case. And the thing is, you'd have to read Josh Swamidass's book to understand that he's sensitive to the theological concerns that Ken Ham is actually concerned with. And in many ways, Swamidass's work you could say, is more literal with the text that Ken Ham is, who likes to think he's literal, but at the end of the day ends up not being literal about lots of things in his interpretation. A quick jaunt over to creation.com. They're talking about that massive millipede that's like, a 6 foot tall millipede that weighed 100 pounds. So it's like the largest invertebrate ever found. It's a really cool fossil. But of course, there's, I could have written the article that they wrote knowing exactly what they would say. And in a few minutes, it's another proof that of a global flood. Like, how could you get this, this millipede preserved in sand that quickly? It would have just rotted if it weren't for a global flood. My response to those is I'm starting to say to myself, why is it always a global flood? Why do they always say this is proof of a global flood, of Noah's flood? Why can't it just be proof of a flood, like any old flood? I was like, if you find evidence that something was encased very quickly in sediment, why is that proof of a global flood? I mean, it's evidence that could be used in support of a global flood, but it's just as much evidence to support a local flood as well. All right, there's another signature there that says this is something that happened during a global flood rather than a more localized flood. Land bridges after the flood. That's just it's a long article of examples of where, because during the Ice Age there were land bridges and that allowed animals to move across the face of the earth and migrate and populate the world after Noah's flood. It's another attempt to try to figure out how kangaroos got to Australia. Oh, a quick caveat here. It's not just kangaroos, right? If you go to the Ark Encounter and you look at the list of what they think all the different kinds are of marsupials, there's 29 different kinds of marsupials that they think are in Australia. Well, maybe there's 28 or 29 kinds, all right, created kinds of marsupials in Australia. And so it's not just they have to explain that that a pair of kangaroos got to Australia. They have to explain how 29 different pairs or different groups of marsupials that got off the ark all went to Australia and didn't leave any remnants behind in any other continent. All right. So that kind of ups the ante on the discussion. Usually that's not discussed. They usually do things by talking about single individual organisms or types of organisms and how they could have migrated. But why should all the marsupials, or all 29 of those marsupials, get together and all jump onto a floating raft of logs together and all end up in Australia and somehow not end up in other places as well? That's kind of a mystery to me. Yeah, let's stop it there. That's our first week of highlights from creationism. Yeah, kind of a big week. I think we've got some interesting things coming up too, because there's been some interesting science stories that I think that young Earth creationists will respond to, but I'll wait till they respond to them before we talk about their responses. Hey, I'm Joel Duff. Thanks for listening. Check me out on thenaturalhistorian.com, where I have several articles that relate to the contents of today's This Week in Creationism. And subscribe to this YouTube channel so you won't miss This Week in Creationism next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.